Welcome to the Remote Clinical Trials Advantages and Challenges think tank. Remote clinical trials are moving beyond the pilot stages and are at the center of conversations happening around virtual R&D tables at most pharma, biotech, CRO, and tech companies around the world. But where are we in terms of current applications and practice of remote trials or remote trial components? How do remote trials impact our clinical endpoints? What directions do we see? And are some endpoints unsuitable for measurement in remote settings? These are just a few of the questions our three industry experts are going to dive into today. First, I would like to introduce our host this morning. Signant Health's Dr. Bill Byrom is a 2017 and 2008 PharmaVOICE 100 and is a world-renowned thought leader in patient-facing technologies, including electronic patient-reported outcome solutions, the use of wearables and connected devices, and new novel technology-derived endpoints. Dustin is an innovator sitting at the intersection of life sciences and technology, with goals focused on making the whole drug development process faster for pharma and better for patients. For almost 20 years, Joe has been a vocal and visible force in the industry, specifically the realm of e-clinical technology, and most recently finishing up a 12-year run with Medidata. Craig Lipset is a 2019 Red Jacket and a 2016 and 2010 PharmaVOICE 100. He is an advisor to technology and biopharmaceutical companies, universities, and the venture community, bringing vision to the intersection of research, digital solutions, and patient engagement. For more details about our panelists, please go to pharmavoice100.com.
So, and I'm going to turn it over to Bill now. So, Bill, I know this is a hot topic for you, so please tell us why that is and what Signant Health is doing to raise the bar, which is our theme for today's event.
So at Signant Health, we believe that these types of changes will continue to be used across the industry even after the pandemic subsides. So in response to this shift, we're focusing on leveraging our technology platform and our deep therapeutic and scientific knowledge and operational expertise to help sponsors implement thoughtful and scalable solutions that will help keep patients engaged and keep studies running while reducing or even eliminating site visits in studies. And we've shown that commitment across three key areas. So first is the patient experience. We're continuously looking for ways in which to simplify study participation for patients and for sites, and to enable greater collection of clinical data remotely without overcomplicating the patient experience. Second, technology. So we believe that modern technology platforms facilitate a more complete clinical trial experience, whether collecting self-assessment data, leveraging telemedicine like we're doing now, or orchestrating third-party activities like courier deliveries or home nurse visits. And then third, scientific and operational expertise. Our teams have shown that it's possible to ensure the integrity and the validity of clinical assessments when they're performed remotely. So our scientific experts help to determine appropriate and optimal ways in which to deliver these clinical assessments remotely. And our data scientists use analytics tools and in-house algorithms to assess the ongoing integrity and consistency of the data that we collect, even when it's collected across multiple modes. Mm. And so the impact of COVID-19 on clinical trial process has been a profound accelerator of these new approaches. And I expect that permanent changes we'll see now in terms of the way we conduct our studies as we progress into the future. So Taren, I'm excited to be here today to continue the dialogue with Joe and with Craig. And I know they're very heavy hitters in terms of innovation in our industry. So I'm really looking forward to what I think is going to be a really interesting conversation. So back to you, Taren.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for all of that. I too am excited to dig into this. And let's level set the conversation by launching a poll. Let's see where our audience is in terms of the elements they're looking to in terms of remote clinical trials and those that they're using. So it looks like remote e-consent, like EPR, ePro, and we have a few that are tied: video visits, direct-to-patient medication supply, nurse home visits. So really across the board. So what was interesting, I think, is the video-enabled clinician assessments and ratings, because I think that's going to have a play in terms of how we go forward in terms of remote clinical trials. So let's dig into it. So, you know, let me ask all of you, where are we in terms of current application and practice of remote trials or remote trial components? Bill, you want to kick us off, and then I'll get Craig and Joe to weigh in.
Yeah, I can do, but I think Joe, actually, you were going to kick this one off, so why don't I just hand over to you at this point?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Bill and Taren. Thanks for everyone for having us. It's a great way to kick off the morning. So where are we in the practice of remote trials? Well, I can say that in my new job now, as a role of clinical innovation at Bristol Myers Squibb, it's true here and everywhere. Decentralized trials, or remote, virtual, hybrid, whatever you want to call it at this point, is here to stay. There is no turning back. I would say, and I think we've all seen the memes, right? COVID-19 has accelerated the transformation of our process faster than any C-level executive or management consultant. I think that 6 months into this pandemic, that clinical trials are now restarting, and many of the studies that were delayed back in April or May or June are going to restart this month. And many of those studies will launch or relaunch with virtual trial capabilities, virtualizing those capabilities in the study. So remote consent, virtual telemedicine visits, advanced sort of ways to do ECOA, collect patient data, patient engagement tools, direct-to-patient shipment of drug. That poll showed it all, right? As we get into studies that are being newly planned now and earlier this year, that will start in 2021, you'll start to see protocols, I believe now, being designed with these capabilities, not as an insurance policy, but as a better way to conduct trials that are more patient-centric, as more of, it's a thoughtful choice as opposed to oh no, what do I do now, right? And so some companies will do this faster than others. Everyone is doing it, both big and small, and everyone in our line of work is planning for it. So there is no going back. This is a monumental change.
Absolutely, Joe. I can't agree with you more.
I may be less bullish and optimistic than Joe even on this one, though. I actually think that there's a toolkit of decentralized research methods, and your poll showed that. And people are grabbing different ones based on their protocol needs, and that's what really makes the most sense. You know, people don't need every solution for every study. They should draw what they need. But I am a little nervous that many organizations are implementing right now out of risk mitigation, not out of a desire to improve long-term access and convenience and diversity. And so I do have I embrace the optimism that Joe shared, but I will add a note of caution. And that note of caution is making this the new normal does require work and commitment. It means you have to change your SOPs, your training, your vendor selection, and ultimately how you write protocols. You need to train not only your own workforce to understand these new tools, but your investigators, patients, and other stakeholders. This can be here to stay, but only if organizations and all of us on these calls are actually taking the steps needed to commit to that change.
And Craig, isn't there something that you're seeing out there? There's an asterisk in some of these plans that what if, and are you saying that companies aren't fully committed to this then?
Well, I think as Joe pointed out, I think there are still a number of organizations that are incorporating these tools as the, in case of pandemic, break glass strategy, right? Maybe they're not in the front line, they're available like visiting nurses or others. Video, we'll deploy it if we need to, we'll have them ready. Some of the components though, as Joe pointed out and as your survey pointed out, really are sticky and in the front line. ePro, ECOA, eConsent. I think organizations were already trying to embrace or fully embracing in many cases. But don't get me wrong, I do agree that many are incorporating that in the front line right now. But I believe for many, it's a case of risk mitigation. How can you be responsible stewards of people's money and people's lives and run a study in 2020 and into 21 without these types of risk mitigation measures? The real challenge, I think, is who is committing to this in their organizations, putting the resources in place, and quite honestly, having the right checks to support that work that's required.
Absolutely. Bill, do you want to weigh in and then we'll go on to the next question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think just maybe a note, you know, and I get what you're saying, Craig, and I think you're absolutely right, of course. But I would also say that it's true that for many of these approaches, so we think of things like direct-to-patient medication supply or remote clinical assessments using video or even remote e-consent, and whilst those haven't necessarily been used at scale, we have been using those things for some time, you know, at a smaller scale across some of our studies. And so it's not that these are untried and untested, it's just, I guess, that we haven't used them at the scale that perhaps we're starting to. And I think we'll come out of, you know, the pandemic with a lot more experience in how to use these technologies, what works well, what doesn't. And I believe that will put us in a really good position to continue to adopt them at a greater pace as we progress.
Excellent. So let's move on to the clinical endpoints. And so how do remote trials impact our clinical endpoints, and what directions do we see, and are some of the endpoints unsuitable for measurement in remote settings? Craig?
Aaron, I would argue that our limitations on endpoints are very often the rate limiter as far as how far we can go in decentralizing a particular program. We know that small molecules and large can be delivered in the home, and there are always going to be special circumstances around studies that involve dose escalation or a new dose for the first time. But in general, if our endpoints are fragile and require an investigator's eyes and hands on a patient directly in order for that measurement to be captured, we're stuck. And we saw that 6 months ago for studies that were relying on a 6-minute walk test, where for years we knew that patients were walking 60 minutes to get to the clinic with a smartphone in their pocket or pocketbook just to be watched walking for 6 minutes and then turn around with the phone in their pocket and walk all the way back. And all that data was being collected. It was being collected ambiently through those sensors on their phone, but it wasn't being captured and utilized. But that requires an investment of time. Validating a digital endpoint isn't something that can be done by a development operations organization when a protocol synopsis is handed down. It needs to be baked into that clinical development plan. The other note I'll add is we shouldn't feel constrained in indications like oncology. As an example, people will often call out, well, what are you going to do? Roll an MRI up to the patient's front yard? Well, for those of us that have worked in oncology, we know our investigators don't have an imaging center always attached to their investigator site. We've, for years, relied on defining image acquisition guidelines to have patients go to local centers and then having imaging core labs or other expertise review and QC those images. And so I think we can think creatively and smart, but it requires time and investment well before the protocol is handed down to DevOps.
Absolutely. Bill, the next question is really for you before we go into our Q&A. Are you at all concerned about increasing the amount of data we collect in unsupervised settings? And what concerns are there?
Well, yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? Because I suppose in theory, if we start to collect data in an unsupervised setting, and particularly if it's a measurement, so not like a patient-reported outcome that we used to giving the patient full responsibility for doing themselves, but maybe it's some other measurement that they're participating in the collection of. You know, are we going to add more variability into the data because of the way that it's done in slightly different ways, but by different patients, etc.? And I suppose, you know, potentially that's the case, but there's also some great benefits from measuring things more frequently. And some of the great data that I saw from the team at Roche, who have been developing the app around Parkinson's disease, and showing that actually if you use that app to measure tremor by having the patient place the phone on their hand and hold it still for 30 seconds and use the accelerometer in the phone to measure that sort of tremor signal, well, actually, by doing that every day, you get a much more complete picture of that symptom, of that effect on those patients than you would do when the patient turns up once every 2 weeks in clinic and they may or may not be exhibiting tremor on that particular day. So actually, the insights you can get from more frequent assessments are really important. And And I suppose, you know, when it comes to how do we start to try to limit the amount of variability we might add because we're doing these things in unsupervised ways, you know, clearly there's training that we can do, but maybe actually the devices we use themselves to collect things can help us with some of that. So, you know, if we think about, I'm doing a postural stability test and I want a patient to hold the smartphone to their chest and I want to measure their sway. Well, actually I've got a proximity sensor in that phone that's going to tell me if they are holding it close to their body or not. And so maybe there are things that we can do in addition to training that can help us to identify when a test has been performed correctly and when it hasn't.
Excellent. Last thoughts, gentlemen, before we open it up to the Q&A?
My only thought here is that, especially as we get into the next year, you're going to find when people talk about remote clinical trials, there tends to be 2 or 3 different ways that what people mean. There's the virtual components and the things that are sort of rising in decentralized trials that are right now happening. It's how do I get my study working now? Remote consent, televisits, shipping products to the home, things like that. And then there's like the mobile health side of it, which is collecting more data remotely and changing the way that analysis is done and whatnot. And then being able to do both of those in the clinic and at home settings and giving the patient the choice on which way they want to go. And we as industry need to be now okay in some cases, of course, when the protocol dictates it, but we need to be okay and change that protocol to say, some patients may elect to do this and other patients may be electing to do this in home or in the clinic, and be okay with it and have, sometimes we're obsessed, again, new guy in pharma, with one SOP for everything, and it needs to be flexible.
Excellent.
So it's an interesting point, Joe, isn't it? And enabling that flexibility around visits, for example, is a really, it could be a really key driver to this sort of idea of patient centricity, whatever we mean by that.
Yes.
But technically it's hard, isn't it? It adds another layer of complexity onto the way we deliver our technology. So if I just think, for example, about medication dispensing, you know, I need to now be able to adapt very quickly to the idea that a patient may not be going to site to get their med. They may want that next month's medication direct to their home. And so being able to flex quickly and have the algorithms behind the scene to do that, it's not, certainly isn't impossible, but it adds another layer of complexity that we need to be able to, we need our technologies to be able to deal with.
It's another layer of complexity on that side, but doesn't it make it easier for the patient ultimately?
Yeah, sure. And that's what we strive for, of course.
Right. What are your thoughts on who should provide tech support, since we're talking about technology, to the patients for the eClinical tools that we're providing? Is it okay for the study team at the sponsor or CRO to provide that support directly? Who wants to jump in?
It's a great question, isn't it? And I was reading an article which was quite challenging recently in JAMA, which, if that's how you pronounce it, I'm not quite sure, about telemedicine unreadiness, it was called. And it was actually a survey that some research had done. It was actually to do with routine care, but the use of telemedicine through the pandemic and the implementation of it, you know, suddenly for patients in routine care. And they were looking at elderly patients. It was in the US only, 65 plus, and I think the average age was actually about 75 or 78. And they found that there was a proportion of patients who really were just unready to use that technology. And one of the factors they identified, aside from things like dementia and other conditions, one of the factors they found was a useful indicator was whether somebody had sent an email, sent an SMS, or gone online in the last month. And they found that was a really good indicator of their readiness to then adopt this sort of video technology in their own home. And so I think what we need to think about is, how do we assess the readiness of individual patients within the populations that we study? And can we provide tools to the site to effectively to identify which patients might need more support, which patients might have a carer at home that could help them with the technology, and which patients really probably can't manage with this and might need a home nurse or something else. And maybe there's a kind of a continuum which is almost personalized in terms of how we get somebody onboarded to use some of these technologies. don't know what Craig and Joe think, but yeah, what do you think, guys?
Well, I do think, organizations need to have thoughtful strategies in terms of ensuring support, whether that's through call center, help desk, Genius Bar-like support. And that's not only for the site staff, but also, as is being pointed out here, pulling all the way through to the patient. We can't, just because we're sending the patient home to do more from home, we can't let them feel alone at any time in this process. And that's also where I think a lot of organizations are starting to think about, what does a concierge really mean here? And it's probably more than just help, like travel support. There's your concierge at your hotel gets you what you need. And maybe that's tech support, and maybe that's help with travel, and maybe it's some other source of anxiety that the patient has. And I think that holistic view of support is where we need to head.
Joe agrees with you. If we could go, Suzanne, thank you so much for that question, Suzanne Kincaid. I have another question. Eve Dreyer is asking, she's actually hoping that this does become the new normal, but she welcomes your observations about how these virtual and other changes will potentially have a significant impact on recruiting multicultural populations to trial enrollment. It's a hot topic right now. So what advantages will this play for those patient populations?
I do think that decentralization is an important component of a thoughtful strategy around improving diversity and representation in our studies. I often think we have two pandemics happening, at least in the US right now, right? One is around COVID and the other is around racial justice. And in many ways, improving access to trials through decentralized approaches can be an important countermeasure for both. But in both cases, it's not the end all. Right? In our trials, we still have other strategies we have to adjust around monitoring and so on. And in our attempts to improve and commit to improving diversity and representation in our studies, there are other elements that still have to happen around earning trust, engaging patients in the communities, and making sure that when we're planning and designing our studies and we're getting better at including patient input from the beginning, those patients represent the patients that we aspire to have in our trials. So I think it's a great component. We can remove access barriers, but it's not a silver bullet.
Excellent. Bill, I'll leave it to you for a final thought, if you don't mind.
Well, really, just to thank Joe and Craig in particular for the time. I know it's early for you guys. I can see you supping your coffee there. It's lunchtime here in the UK, which is nice. But I just think a great topic. It's been such a challenging season, but an exciting one as well, in the sense of being able to adapt, being able to use technologies that actually we already have in place, but maybe we just haven't used at scale before. And I guess I'm excited to see the experience we get from them as we progress. So again, thank you for your time, Taren.
Thank you all very well. And thank you to our audience. You've provided us with a lot of thought-provoking questions, and we are going to capture these in the chat, and we'll see what we can do with this content as we move forward. But I want to thank you gentlemen for a great conversation. And I want to let the audience know that you can follow our thought leaders on Twitter to continue the conversation using the hashtag PharmaVOICE100. Their handles are on our speaker tab at pharmavoice100.com. And I want to thank Signant Health very sincerely for your support of our 24 hours marathon, celebration marathon, and of this think tank.
For more PharmaVoice 100 content, visit www.pharmavoice100.com.